classes can have use the term links for introducing for the relationship between objects, and we can use the term association to find the relationship between classes. As you know, the classes and objects are different terms, not the same. Okay, this is for you, and because that the objects are instances of our class, is an instance of a class. We make terms more clear lecture, and needed if our sense that it's needed an implementation for these concepts in practice. There is no problem. I can use Java environment to define this concept. You want to we have an implementation this for this concept. Please tell me to make an implementation for our concepts. This first slide defines the relationships as links and association, as I told you. Relationships, as you see in this slide, is defined as the semantic connections things make relationship and a student in education, because student can register in a course could be reserved by a student. Okay, so semantic connection, semantic relationship between these classes. So the relationships are semantic connections things, but as I told before, associations are connections between classes not the same with classes. Class define a template. For example, as you see before, and the third part is list of operation. This notation, as you remember, make a template, make a format for define group. So associations or depend. dependencies with more details and applications. When one object holds an object reference to another, because when we want semantic connection types to data types, we should use an object. ATM case study. For example, want to implement a transaction. This reference to, for example, it should print out some messages. So we have a semantic connection between two classes. Okay, and in practice, when we want to implement this class, we should define an attribute for a transaction type screen. Usually make a reference to a screen. This is also for this relationship. For this one, we should to bank database. You have here. Excuse me. Here, not. No, 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 no. You have some access to keypad and cache dispenser, because in our design, UML diagram, have two relationships between withdrawal, one for keypad. So in implementation of this class, we should make two references for these two classes. Okay, a link occurs when another object we have a class template, not an object, but where an object of type withdraw. Later in later implementation, we want to execute a transaction, we should make an transaction. So when we want to implement this class, we have no till now. When we execute this and when the and the system tries to make a transaction, send the links when we existence. So collaborating with its has with cache display. Occurs when others across links. This is straightforward for you. Okay. Object is also not. Please tell me to implement. Okay, I think they are simple for you. Diagrams define links between objects in object diagram. Objects and their links at a particular point of time. Please note that we have two diagrams in object diagram. These two diagrams, okay. The object diagram shows a snapshot of a system at the same time. But the class diagram is a structure defines structure of our classes and their class diagram with their relationships. But in object diagram, uh, when we make a snapshot, just some of our objects are instantiated. We have some instances for a piece of our classes diagram than class diagram, but the object diagram will change time to time. Okay, there are snapshots of an executing object-oriented system at a particular time. I told you this. Objects may adopt other. We can define role for object in our diagram. For example, this is not a part of class diagram, but or in fact, of this link, the two ends are both in a class, not the owner. This is an object of person details. This is an object of type address. How we can detect, how can determine that this diagram is. Please note that in object typical class, the column sign. We start by the column sign. Say say that is instance in object. So we can define role for our objects. Think this unidirectional link, we have object diagram. In this object diagram, we define, okay, there are three instances in this diagram. But each of three different instances in related class diagram, we just define a snapshot of the internal state of our system. The person class, we should have a link. As you know, the relationship in a book club is that the ILA is chairperson. This over near its owner object. Okay. For example, say Erika is a secretary of the club, and Naomi is a member of the club. Okay. So in this class, in this object, the role is for some of objects. Objects may adopt roles in a linked of it's straightforward for you. The ternary links we can have in this object diagram, see a binary link which connect two objects. A binary link connect more than two objects, they are drawn and have not any call for this type of link, the NR link in this as a link. As you know, association defined as a class and person class has an association with each other, and when we make an instance of class, an instance of club, such as book club, and when such as ILA, we can define a link of this relation. Okay, and the role name of this object make it more meaning us. Make an association or a link is a meaningful relationship. So is an instant. And when we have a link between two objects, we should have an association between their classes. So the association between classes in class diagram are equivalent with a link diagram. Links are instances of association, just as objects are instances of class. Okay. Associate detail. Associations class diagram. In our object diagram, we can do some options as they are in class diagram. We can have an association name for each association. I'm sorry. For example, the company can employ a person or some persons. So this association could have a name such as you see here. Okay. And the arrowhead next to this association name shows the flow of control. For example, company employs person. The person employed by a company. Okay. And we can have role name for our associations. But when we define role name for related object, we don't use an association name because they are define the same story. They define the same thing. The company employs a person, the company is employer, and the person is employed. So the role of this object, these classes, can define who employs what. Okay, and we can have multiplicity. I talked about multiplicity in our case study, our ATM case study, and navigability, as I told you before in our case study. And you know that when we want to implement our design, the navigability helps us to prioritize implementing the classes which should be implemented first and which should not. Okay. There are some common names and roles in associations. You can read these comments. These slides are so good that they are self-learning slides, and you can read these slides, and there is no problem. Mr. Ramsin have defined these concepts more easier than me. Okay. Uh, Please note that note to this last point, which said that use either an association name or role names, but not both. They are not used together in our designs because they confuse uh, our developers and our team members. We have talked about the multiplicity over the which is defined over our associations. For example, a company can employ 0 or more persons, and each person could be employed by one company. And these arrowheads translate the meaning of these associations. A company employs many persons, and when we want to show the relationship from this side to this side, we can say that each person works for one company. The term one and each person are determined by this multiplicity signs. Okay, each person works for a company, for one company, not for two or more company. It's important in practice when we want to implement the class diagram. There are several types for multiplicity signs, and this is an example for applying these types of multiplicities. Please see this example and these types of multiplicity. If you have question, please ask your question so that I reply you. Okay, you have no problem with these types of multiplicity. Let me go ahead. I told enough about this before, and there are some associations which we named them reflexive associations, in which a class could have an association with itself. For example, in a directory system of our operating systems, you know that each directory can have some directories and some files. So a directory has a relationship with its subdirectory, and the subdirectories are also directory of type directory. And the multiplicity of this relationship is the parent directory or super directory has a relationship with more subdirectories, zero or more subdirectories. And each directory could include several files, which could be zero or more files. As you know in this, as you see in this chart, the C directory contains three other subdirectories and two files. And furthermore, this my document directory contains just two John file, this file. And there is no subdirectory for this one. So there is no link between this subdirectory and its internal subdirectories. So this the multiplicity of this relationship with its subdirectory is of type 0 subdirectory. There is a 0 subdirectory for this directory. So we can define in practice some relationship, some reflexive relationship to show the relationship each object with its sub objects, for example. Uh, we can define some hierarchical arrangement between reflexive about reflexive associations between our objects or our classes. For example, for this class diagram, we have a self or reflexive association between each instance of class A with several other classes of type A. For example, at the first level, an object A1 has a relationship between with three other objects of type A as B1, C1, and D1. But C1 has no relationship with other objects at its sub classes at this hierarchy. Okay, and this is another type of class diagram and an example for showing this the instances relationships of this association. Okay. Uh, as I told you, we have told enough about navigability, and there is talk about this one. If needed, please tell me to talk about the. I talked enough in when we explain our ATM case study. Zero and one means zero or and one. Zero instance or one instance of a class. For example, let me Zero or object means that we can have no any instance of A in our system at all. Okay, the zero means we have no any instance of this class. But the one defines just one instance of this class. For example, for each of these leave classes, we have no any instances of class A that have a relationship and association with these leave classes. Okay. Associations and attributes. We talked about associations and attributes before because when we want to implement the withdrawal class in our implementation for the ATM case study, you have seen that, for example, in a withdrawal implementation, we should make references to other classes such as keypad and cash dispenser, which they have an association with the withdrawal. You have seen this before, but I want to read these comments if there is any point to explain. I will explain that. An association between two classes is equivalent to one class having a pseudo attribute. The pseudo attribute means that we have a reference. For example, in our design, we have an association between withdrawal and cash dispenser and one association between withdrawal and keypad. So we in practice, when we want to implement this class, we should define two semi-attribute or pseudo-attribute for these two classes for in order to make references to these classes. So in practice, we should define an attribute for each of these two classes, an attribute for keypad and attribute for cash dispenser in withdrawal class to make a reference to those instances. Okay. So an association between two classes is equivalent to one class having a pseudo attribute that can hold a reference to an object of the other. You can often use associations and interchangeably in this slide. And when, excuse me, I for a moment. Excuse me. For example, in this case, a house should have an address. As you know, address is a multi-part entity, multi-part concept. For example, the address should contain the country, the city, the state, the avenue, and so on. Okay, so in practice, for the address field in our design, it may to design a standalone class for address, and when we want to have instances of this type, we should make a pseudo attribute in our classes, such as this one for host. So in practice, when we want to implement this relationship, this association, we should define an attribute for address of type address with capital A. I think it's trivial also, and there is no ambiguous point to talk about. Let me go ahead. Association classes. In practice, sometimes we may define association class for to showing an association. As you know, by default, we implement an association between two classes by defining a reference or pseudo attribute, as you saw. No, but sometimes we define a standalone class to define this association. This is the same when we have many-to-many relationship between objects or entities in relational database. You have seen the same situation in a relational database. The concept in this lecture is a qualified associations. A qualified association, when we have an association between two classes, and one class has a relationship with many instances of the other end of the association, such as this, we can use to on one link in practice. For example, a club have a link with every member of the club, but in this design, we justify that we means that the link between one member ID with just a special member ID. So define the member ID as a to show the link between an instance of the class with an instance. Uh, as you see, this last point said that they are useful way of drawing attention to a unique identifier. Some members of the class are so special. For example, a chairperson of the class is a special member of the class. Okay, and when you want to drawing attention to the chairperson, you can define the relationship between class and the chairperson with this type of using of quantifier. The member ID of the chairperson should be written here. Okay. There are several dependencies which are explained in these slides. I don't want to explain them for you. Three types of dependencies are defined in this. Actually, I didn't use these types of dependency in practice, and skim these slides, and left them for you to read yourselves, and if needed, please search about these types of dependencies. Use this relationship in my projects. I don't have any experience about them. If you want, you can read these slides yourself. There is about 5 slides, and there is no any other concepts in this lecture to talk about. The reference of these slides also is the unified process, as you see. If you have any questions about this concept, please ask your questions. I think these concepts are trivial for you, and if you have make an implementation, you have seen these concepts in practice. Who make implementation for ATM case study? Dear friends, please reply me. Please answer me. Move on. Okay, Miss Mariam, working on the okay, Miss Fadia. Others, just 2 students work on ATM case study. Okay. So I think it's enough for this session. If you have no question, let me to finish the session. I see you session. Thank you for your attention and for your attention to our